Welcome, a warm welcome from all of us at ACLS, the American Council of Learned Societies. My name is Joy Connolly. I'm honored to serve as president of ACLS, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you here today through this invaluable technology, Zoom, which lets us to connect hundreds of people across time and space. We have a particularly diverse international program and panel for you today, and it's so much easier and so wonderful to be able to connect people using this technology to have the lively conversation I know we're going to have. The title of our panel is A Healthy Ecosystem for Humanities Scholarship, the Evolving Role of Open Access, a topic we know at ACLS is of intense interest to all our constituencies. What are our constituencies? Since 1919, ACLS has served scholars in the form of offering fellowships and grants and offering professional development and intellectual development support for scholars. We also serve our learned societies, as our name suggests, now 79 in number, in a variety of ways. We work with schools in networks, our consortium, our Research University Consortium, and our Associates Network, the most well-known of those networks. And finally, we serve the system of higher education, and specifically the humanities and social sciences, from our base in the United States, but reaching around the world by trying to do really a number of things. We seek, above all, to support the circulation of humanistic knowledge in a variety of forms and styles. We also seek, and we have sought again since our founding in 1919, to support cutting-edge methodologies and new areas of scholarship. And it's really this that brings us here today to talk about open access, to talk about scholarly publishing, to talk about how we can best support a healthy ecosystem for all involved in the work of producing and circulating knowledge in a variety of forms, but specifically in the written form of the journal, the monograph, those key pieces of scholarly and to a certain degree public deliberation and knowledge and insight. So it's with great pleasure that I turn the expert moderation of our discussion over to my colleague, James Shulman. James, as you could see from the slideshow before I began speaking, is the vice president at ACLS. And as someone who comes with many years of experience in thinking about the storing and circulation and making available of knowledge in his role as the founding president of ArtStore, he brings a deep expertise in this topic. So James, over to you, and thank you everyone for making time to listen to our expert panelists today.
Great, thanks, Joy. And I urge the panel to join us and use the magic of Zoom to appear. Here we are. Great. Nice to see you all again. Welcome everyone. As Joy said, this is part of ACL's work to think with our various constituencies about what are healthy paths forward. And open access is a topic that draws strong emotions in favor. I actually don't know many people who have strong emotions against, but many people have strong questions about how to make it work best. And I think for us at ACLS, one of the contexts that talking about these issues fits into is really about institutional change. I mean, some of the paths forward seem clear and reasonable in academic publishing, and yet getting there seems to be incredibly hard. So I think we're very lucky today to have a panel to talk about these issues, both in terms of journal literature, where as we know, the issues are framed in the context of a big science industry of journal literature, where the issues are, some of them are similar and some are very different. And then also in terms of scholarly monographs and books. So we have people who know a lot about all this. So what I'd love to do is ask all the panelists, I'll call on you one by one, just to say what brings you here, what your particular perspective on questions around access and open access, what your perspective is, where you're coming from. We'll do that for a couple of minutes just so that the audience gets to know you and what brings you here today. And then we have lots of questions. And then around 5 o'clock, so in about 50 minutes, we'll turn to questions from the audience and urge people to put them in the Q&A, and we'll go through them and bring you all into the conversation. So maybe we could start with Alexia.
James, thank you so much. And I'm thrilled to be here with all of these distinguished panelists today. And thanks to all of our colleagues from around the world joining us. So for those who know me well, you know that I am a DEIA practitioner, scholar, and champion. And so one of the reasons why this conversation is really principally important to me, and as I imagine to many of you all as well, is that I really do see open access and open scholarship as contributing elements to the entire information ecosystem through which we can have more equitable discourse in relation to scholarly output, more equitable analysis in the context of who gets to be able to contribute, what forms of scholarship, and subsequently how that scholarship is prioritized. And so I am really thrilled to have this dialogue with you all, because I also see our learned societies as integral in helping to build the coalitions that are necessary to have the supporting social and technological infrastructure to make these types of endeavors successful. So thank you. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Great. Aileen?
Thanks, James. So thank you all for having me here. I come to you from Scotland in the United Kingdom. I'm a historian, professor of history at the University of St Andrews. And so I'm here wearing several hats, and we can decide which of my hats is relevant. Obviously, invisible hats, you realize. As a historian, I'm obviously a humanities scholar. I write journal articles, I write books. My next monograph will be coming out open access later this year. My articles have been open access for several years, because I also, of course, work in the UK academic context, which is strongly influenced by the EU, despite various political things that have happened. We have a much stronger open access policy world on our side of the Atlantic. So my University of St Andrews is very proud to claim that 91-point-something% of our research publications are open access. That puts us in the top 10 of the Leiden rankings for universities with the most open access. And that's partly the UK policy world. It's also partly my institution's efforts to bring about institutional change by persuading me and all my colleagues to actually do something about this. Though so far most of this has been about journals, we're just moving in the UK towards worrying about monographs as well. So we can certainly talk about that later. But the real reason I'm on this panel, I assume, is because my historical research for the last several years has been on the history of scientific journal publishing. So I've been studying the history of the world's longest running scientific journal, which is published by the Royal Society in London and has been since the late 17th century. And me and my team spent a lot of time looking at the editorial and financial issues behind the scenes of the printed page, looking at how journals actually work and how the way that journals work has changed over time. And one of the things we discovered through doing this was that the publishing of scientific journals has not been a profit-making activity for most of history. For the vast majority of history of the Royal Society and other organisations like it, they have been publishing and paying for the circulation of their journals as an act of mission, because of a mission for scholarship at great cost to the society, supported by donors, third parties, various other things along the way. We can talk about that funding model later as well. But the point is not supported through commercial sales. And that shift to commercial sales for the scientific journal publishing world only happened after the Second World War. And it's one of the things that strikes me about the open access debates is that we have forgotten the longer history of the circulation of knowledge. It was different in a paper-based age than it can be now in a digital age, but the idea that you can pay for the knowledge that we researchers produce to be circulated by sending copies of journals to libraries around the world to make them accessible to the end user at no cost to the end user is something that has a lot of resonance to the open access movement now, although obviously our technologies are different. So that was one of the big findings from our project. So I'm a historian of scientific journals, and as a historian, of course, I'm interested in long form monographs too. So I've got both of those things going on. I'll also say that because of my research in learned societies, and because of my membership of several learned societies, I care a lot about the role of learned societies, not just as publishers of journals, but also as communities of academics. And I think that as we try to work out ways to bring about culture change within academia, to persuade, perhaps not me, perhaps not the panelists, perhaps all of our colleagues who are not yet persuaded that they are going to risk making their book open access or risk publishing, that's a question of organizational change. And I think the learned societies as communities of scholars have got a very powerful role to play in making it normal to want to do open access, in showing why this is a good thing for all of us as scholars to want to make our work far more accessible than it would be if we stuck to the more old-fashioned ways of doing things. Thank you.
Great. Alexandra.
Hi, thank you so much, James. And you can call me Alex, by the way. And nice to be here with everyone and the other panelists. So I come at this really from three different perspectives, which are all evolving in real time as open access itself is evolving. The first is in my role as Associate Dean for the Humanities at the University of Michigan. I have been very involved in the TOME program towards an open monograph ecosystem. I always get confused about the acronym that I should know very well, but TOME is a good one. So I have seen this evolve over the past 3 to 4 years and have noticed a real uptake and a greater enthusiasm about open access in terms of humanities monographs. So that's one thing. And I can share some, with the help of some of my colleagues, I've collected some of that data that I'd be happy to share with you about how our program has developed over the past 5 years. The second is I'm someone who's very committed, as I know many of those on this meeting today are, to access in terms of accessibility, access for people with disabilities, using assistive technologies, and some of the really important ways in which open access can, physically and, virtually make materials available to a wider set of users through a wider set of technologies. And finally, the questions that I've really been grappling with as I was asked to be on this panel are questions of what are good, equitable practices for open access going forward in really a transnational or international sense. So, I think we're at a moment now where, against the backdrop, and we're still swimming in it, unfortunately, of COVID, and really kind of what that did to the demand and accessibility of online materials, we have both in the humanities an increased acceptance and awareness of an open access. We have the backdrop of COVID. We have, we're in a moment now where I think we need to really shape open access in ways that ensure that we're not replicating some of the inequalities in access and publication that have marked scholarly publication over the past so many decades. So I'm really thinking about this in a global sense, and I know we have many attendees from across the world, and really thinking about how can open access be truly open access for all in the global South and the global North. I look forward to hearing others' comments on that as well. So those are my main points of entry, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the panelists and the attendees. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Alex. Brett.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me. I work for the NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities, which is a U.S. funder of the humanities. I think I really got started in open access a number of years ago. Talking to university presses and others in the field, it struck me that the humanities monograph world is quite different from the commercial book world, right? In the commercial book world, publishers have to make a profit to survive, and authors need to get paid because that's literally their job. They write books for a living. But that's not really the case with university presses. Most university press monographs are written by scholars, and very few humanities scholars are making money off the books they sell. It's not what they're doing for a living. They are publishing a book for two reasons, right? One reason is because they want their scholarship to get out there into the community. And the other reason is probably for promotion and tenure purposes, right? But it seems to me that if everyone acknowledges the fact that we don't need to sell a ton of these books, and that we're not going to sell a ton of these books, why are we charging for them? If the average humanities monograph only sells 200 or 300 copies, that means hardly anyone's buying them. And the amount of money that the press is bringing in for 200 copies is a few $1,000s. It's minuscule in the grand scheme of things. So started thinking about ways in which the NEH as a funder could help. We currently have a grant program which explicitly addresses this. It's called the Fellowships Open Book Program. We've had other programs over the years, but the idea is that these programs are giving grants directly to university presses to encourage them to take monographs and flip them to open access, so that once they're OA, they're available for free forever to everyone on Earth. And that's a very powerful idea. And one of the things I've found is that scholars really love this. Not every scholar is an expert in open access, but when you say to them, hey, instead of your book selling 200 copies, we're going to position it so it's going to get thousands and thousands of downloads from people all around the world. Most scholars think that's really awesome because it's getting their scholarship out to a much wider audience, including a lot of people from, for example, less resource universities, less resource parts of the world, even people who aren't scholars, people in the world that just enjoy reading scholarship can now read their book. So it gets their book into all kinds of conversations that it didn't get into before. So we're really keen about that. I think the other reason we're doing these grant programs is also just to help make OA more the norm. Every grant we give to a university press means more staff at university presses are accustomed to doing OA books. They know how it works. They know how CC licenses work. They understand how an EPUB works, et cetera. So it makes it an easier thing to do. But it also helps, I hope, condition the field to see fantastic books that are open access. In other words, this argument that, that maybe you heard 10 years ago, well, OA books are just like self-published things, they're not peer-reviewed. But when you start seeing wonderful peer-reviewed scholarship coming out in OA, hopefully this notion that a book has to be bound on paper and paid for in order for the writer to get a promotion will fade away. At least that's kind of the hope. So in any case, that's kind of the perspective I come from in terms of the Humanities open access monographs. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Brett. Anita.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for allowing me to be here. I'm coming to the world of open access through the lens of the performing arts and through the lens of community engagement performance. I know that open access is not the same as digital publication. However, most open access volumes are made available digitally. And that is very important for someone who does criticism and analysis or historical context for performing arts. Because in my field, it's so important for people to be able to relate the analysis to the actual gestures, sounds, and visual movements. They're so much a part of the world of the performing arts. So I want to target that. Also, because often the products that we are analyzing are connected to individual creators, it's important to those creators to be able to have their work seen in as large a context as possible. So it serves two things at once. It both serves the artists that we're writing about, the historical knowledge that we're trying to share, and actually the way in which we are able to write about what we're seeing on the screen. In terms of working with community engagement projects, and especially with the Racial Justice Institute, I think that as we try to advocate for decentering knowledge away from the academic ivory tower, it's really important for us to have shared texts that we can work on together that are openly available to the communities in which we're working with. And finally, I also want to talk about this kind of emergence of the area of collaborative scholarship, where I'm designing together, where in the academy is in conversation with community groups. I think it's very important that we're able to have these shared documents that are only available through open access. And finally, I would like to say that junior scholarships, having worked previously as a director of faculty affairs at the University of Michigan, junior scholars are very invested in new forms, new methods of collaborative scholarships, new ways of engaging with the communities that are the subjects of their work, and that they are advocates of this kind of open access in general. And that's kind of what I bring to the table in this conversation. Thank you.
Great. Well, those I already have 14 directions I'd love to follow, but I'm going to start by thinking of a phrase that Anita used, both to reinforce what the five of you say about the importance of these directions. And the phrase that you used was shared text, right? That we don't have that open access allows us to have some shared text that we can all call upon. And just to highlight some of the questions of inequity, I mean, we often think about inequities between wealthy institutions or wealthier countries and libraries or universities in other parts of the world, where the fees that are charged for subscriptions or for purchasing materials are just not possible, right? So we think of the global inequities, but of course, you know, at ACLS, thinking of scholars beginning of their careers, the idea that people, we all know that the academic job market is difficult. So people leaving, you know, finishing up their PhD, if they don't have a dependable institutional affiliation, are suddenly cut off from access to the materials that they need to do their work. And so the inequities, you know, in terms of economics, in terms of you know, institutional histories and institutional access and opportunities are really widespread. And then, as many of you raised, you know, then there's the idea that scholars actually want their materials to be read, right? Like, I mean, that's why, who would want his or her work to, you know, be hidden as much as possible, right? So there seem to be so many reasons to go ahead and to press forward on developing the answers to these, to what kinds of system changes are needed. Let me do the following. So I think we all agree about why this is so important. Let me suggest that we're going to split up the time for at least the next half hour between journal literature and books. And obviously we may go back and forth, but I think it's useful. Just let's spend a few minutes on the barriers of journal literature, because it's something, as Brett said, I think, and a number of you mentioned, you know, books are a different system, and they have their own possibilities and their own challenges. So let me start with, to personalize this with journal literature. Working with ACLS, our scholarly societies in the humanities and social sciences, and throughout the conversation, I will probably use a shorthand of humanities sometimes, but obviously interpretive social sciences are very similar in terms of long form publishing in many cases. So because of what Aileen said, that the publishing industry, for-profit and nonprofit, has built up in various ways over the last 70 years in terms of how and where, how scholarly literature is disseminated. Humanities journals produced, the ones that are produced by the learned societies with whom we work, are distributed through the system. So while many of our societies, member societies, have open access journals also, some of them are highly dependent on a key journal that they put together with enormous faculty volunteer labor for editing, obviously for contributing journals. And then those journals are put together by the society, distributed often through either a university press or a for-profit press, commercial press. And the societies at this point are fairly dependent on the revenue from that contract. Contracts evolve, they might change over time. What do we think of ways of recognizing the good that is done by the coordination of the societies, but the complexity of getting to the desirable goals that we all were talking about today, when the journal business model is sort of stuck in this subscription model, which works very well, works, as you say, for the credentialing and the prestige, but that currency of prestige is intertwined with the currency of libraries writing checks. I think you're all on mute, so feel free to jump in.
All right, I shall jump in since I was the one who did say I spoke about journals. I mean, it is a challenge in so many ways. I think it would be quite interesting to reflect as a group of humanities and social scientists on what the differences actually are between journal publishing and monograph publishing, because they do have different histories. But one of the things that strikes me about the history of research monograph publishing is that it has been financially challenging for quite a long time, and publishers have had to be creative in finding cross subsidies or external subsidies or grants from various places, because it's known to be difficult because you're not going to sell very many copies. Whereas journal publishing for the last 70 years has become profitable, and and people have forgotten that there used to be ways to fund it differently. And it's also different because the university presses have such a strong role in our monograph publishing. I know there are also commercial book publishers, but the university presses are also communities with strong ties to scholarship in a way that some of the big commercial journal publishers are not. And I was doing some work on the 1950s recently, where there's some great quotations about how these commercial publishers that have recently appeared on the scene of journal publishing are managing to make money out of it, which was a big surprise to the learned societies at the time, who'd never managed to make money out of it. But they said there's a real worry that if commercial interests start to drive the show, I'm paraphrasing, that the interests of scholarship will be damaged, because ultimately the interests of the commercial publishers is different from that of the scholars. And it worked for about 20 years, but since then we've been seeing divergence. I think the role of university presses has been really important in keeping the links of the scholarly community and the publishers closer together in monograph publishing. Whereas in journal publishing, we've come to believe that the way the big companies are publishing our journals is the way it has to be. And there are plenty of people in the world of science journal campaigning now who are saying that we need to try and break that link, break our dependence on the big journal publishers, find a different way of publishing our journal articles, basically to take back control, to bring back journal publishing into the hands of the academic community. But we do still need someone to provide certain services. The question is, how many of those services do we need and who's the right person to provide them? So I mean, in more practical terms, I know the challenges for any society that already has a journal that works in a certain way, that is used to doing things this way, with this many editorial assistants, with this amount of money coming in from the publisher. It's really difficult to move away from that. I do quite seriously wonder if it is easier to be a startup, starting from scratch, to start an OA journal, and then you've got a clean slate to start from. Trying to flip an existing journal, I think when you've got that legacy of expectations about how to do it and what you get from it, it really is difficult. I could say more, but I'm going to let someone else talk.
And
I would hope that the COVID crisis. Oh, I'm sorry, James. So please go ahead.
No. Please go ahead, Alexia.
I was going to say that I would hope that the COVID crisis brings forth new iterations and new ideas and concepts in relation to creativity as we think about the ways in which scholarship can be produced, right? And so many of the things that I talk to people about is that, at least for me, COVID has brought forth a lot of existential questions, you know, about me as an individual, about the positionality of academic libraries, the positionality of the entire information ecosystem. And I think that we have some questions to tussle with around how we assign prestige and why. Why do we privilege journals in some aspects over monographs? Are there other scholarly publishing models that will achieve everything that we need to achieve in a more equitable fashion, rather than kind of a reliance on a 17th, 18th, or potentially 19th century philosophy of how scholarship is elevated and celebrated within the academy and with various peer institutions? And so that's, you know, I don't necessarily have like a clear answer, but I would hope that, you know, this crisis has brought us to a place and space where we can continually iterate and then ultimately move towards action around various creative solutions in relation to how we think about the presentation of scholarship beyond some of the traditional publishing models.
Can I say there that that's one of the reasons I think learned societies could, and subject associations and other things like that, can be so important, because when you get new startups like
Absolutely.
this, if it's
yes.
one scholar or two scholars, it's difficult to keep going. But if you've got a learned society, you've got a group of people behind you, you've got some momentum, but you've also got credentialing going in there, because you've got a body of people who think this is the way to do things, this is what's good scholarship in our field. So I'd really like to see, in the UK, our learned societies haven't necessarily been at the forefront of this discussion. I'm not sure what it's like for you in the US.
Do we think that the financial models, again, sticking with journals, but I think this will lead us into monographs, as Aileen's posited, the financial model, you know, made money appear where there wasn't money before, right? Like that selling subscription to a journal is not, you know, is not an act of nature. It's an act of an institutional structure of the last 70 years. So, but once that money is appearing, it's hard to sort of forego that money. Do we think that model how does that interact with the currency of prestige? In the sense that a journal that obviously garners that kind of subscription revenue garners it because institutions keep subscribing and contributors want their articles in that journal. So the prestige economy is coincident with the financial economy. So does one change the prestige economy before the financial model or after? How might one tinker with that?
I'd have to ask how closely they are linked, because it's the librarians who make the publishing decisions with their difficult budgets, and the academics who decide where to send their journals. I mean, yes, they are linked in the sense that will you send your article to a journal if you've never heard of it because you've never seen it in your library? So I grant you there is a link. But I'm not convinced that people in my discipline, if they think, what are the good journals send my articles to? That's not really conditioned by how many subscriptions that journal has. It's to do with the culture in my field, in my learned societies and associations, where my colleagues are publishing, where I've read articles from. So I'd go for changing the culture first, and worry about. But I know we have to have a financial model that works as well. But I will point out that although you're saying it's been around the last 70 years, yes, that is what I said a moment ago, but it hasn't. It's been in crisis since at least the 90s, if not the late 80s. So it's not as if we've had a model based on the benefits of Cold War funding, because that's where the money came from. That's why it became possible to sell subscriptions to libraries, was because of the huge funding for particularly science and technology in the early Cold War decades. And that hasn't been around. ARL has been dealing with the serials crisis since about 1986. They started collecting data on it. So it's been struggling for a while.
I think that when you're talking about the humanities publications and the learned societies, you're also talking a lot about labor. I mean, I understand about the financial model and the need for some income to come in from the sales, but I think that from when I sat on the board of some of the learned societies that are part of ACLS, the real question is about the labor that the people are putting into screening for the journals. And I think that that's a part of that labor would continue. And I think that prestige is what can change first, because if people can hold on to the prestige, I think the financial is not as important to the societies as one might think, because the societies are funded through member contributions in the first place, right? I mean, that's their main income stream is membership, not journals.
Well, I mean, these are all pieces of the puzzle. And I think, as you say, the income from journal subscriptions can be significant in some societies. As you say, membership is always the primary source of revenue. And I think the labor issues are also adding stress to the system, Anita, because I mean, there's enormous amount of unpaid labor going into the production of journals and peer review generally, right? And I think this is becoming, and I don't mean to wax nostalgic about golden days, but I think the amount of recognition that universities, colleges and universities are able to give it for the role of an editor or serving in a certain capacity in a society is diminishing. So now the work is being put on, I mean, more work is being expected from committees and from editors, enormous amount of work, right? And then, as you say, when back to Alexia's earlier points about the equity issues, as fields are seeking to diversify their areas of coverage, they're drawing in more overworked and unpaid labor. So to help edit and help to strengthen the widening of the fields. So the labor model is very stressed. You're absolutely right.
And I think that learned societies, I mean, the prestige comes from readership. So open access would only increase the readership. And I think that's another way to think about prestige. Most of us are working as academics in niche markets, especially when you're talking about compared to commercial publication. So it would only increase the prestige if we were able to in some way fund the open model. My personal feeling is that the income is less important than one might think in this cycle.
Yeah, it's really interesting, the socio-technical problems sometimes point to a technical problem when it might actually be a social problem, right? And I think whether the technical problem is actual technology or whether it's financial modeling, sometimes it's actually more of a resistance to cultural change, as you say. Brett.
I wanted to raise a couple points. I think first of all, it's important to think when you're looking at journals, right? You've got two very different kinds of publishers. You've got these huge commercial publishers like Elsevier, and they're making gigantic profit off of the backs of the authors here. But then you've also got, in some cases, very small learned societies with their own journals who are probably making very small amounts of money. So we've got two very different kinds of publishers there. And I do think that part of the cultural change has to be, why are we publishing with large commercial entities that are making so much money when we don't need to be? And are and then of course these large journals are then charging our libraries enormous amounts of money to subscribe to those journals, right? So the question is why, right? A related question is, getting back to the prestige issue, right? Is who needs that prestige, right? Universities are in a sense, they're trying to decide who should we hire, who should we promote. But they are then relying on these outside entities to provide the data they use for deciding who gets promotion. Instead of universities paying enormous amounts to subscribe to Elsevier journals, what if they use that money to support smaller journals, perhaps led by learned societies, and use that as input for hiring people, right? I mean, the universities, they need that information. I mean, when a university is hiring someone in their IT department, they might pay to have a headhunter, right? That you pay, usually an employer pays to get information about who they should hire. But it seems like it's odd that the university is kind of getting that info for free, or and of course they're really not, because they're actually paying the journal through their library. So, which is a complicated way of saying that this is a very sticky problem. But as they say though, the money is in the system. There's plenty of money there to properly pay people to be editors and create journals, and for people to publish in them on a nonprofit scale. We don't need to be doing this we don't need to have giant commercial publishers involved at this point. They would not be happy to hear me say that, but I think the learned societies could do a better job being innovators in this space. I think too often I hear learned societies are just like so worried, oh my God, if we go open access, we might not have money to survive. Well, I don't think that's a good attitude that's going to keep you around for a long period of time. It reminds me of when they first invented, the TiVo, where you could skip a commercial, and companies wanted to ban it because they didn't want people to not watch their commercials. Well, it's sort of, I feel that way about, if open access is going to put your learned society out of business, then maybe you don't deserve to be in business, right? We need to think about, they need to be more innovative, I think, in terms of figuring out how to provide genuinely useful things to their community that are worthwhile, so that they're getting paid. Again, I realize it's a very, very complicated issue, and I'm not suggesting we could solve this tomorrow, but I do feel like we need to think harder about ways in which to create nonprofit journals for people to publish in that charge reasonable amounts but still pay their editors appropriately, and figure out how the universities should be involved in funding them. I'll stop there.
Great. We want to come back to, let's make sure we come back to the point that there is money in the system. That's going to be a key point. And I think when we get to monographs, we can look at that a little more. But then Aileen and then Alexia.
Thanks. I think that was very thought-provoking, Brett, and you're reminding me that there was a study of UK learned societies looking at how much income they get from publishing or not. So just for those of you who are wondering, 26% on average of UK learned societies' income from publishing activities, but varies dramatically. Another stat for you, the research that was done on looking at who controls journals and how important the big 4 or 5 commercial publishers are in the world. In the social sciences, the big 5 commercial publishers dominate about 70% of journal output globally. It's slightly less in the natural sciences because there's a couple of pretty important learned societies which are big publishers there. And in humanities, it's only about 40% for the big 4 or 5 commercials, because there are so many of these tiny little learned societies that we all know and love. And so humanities journal publishing is a different beast. Yes, we do have journals with the big 4 or 5. And we also have all these small organizations that only have 1 or 2 journals. And that, I think, is a big challenge for the learned society who's going, help, scary, open access, how do we do it? And I think there's a thing about economies of scale, and it's easier for a learned society who's run, imagine a learned society who's run by volunteers, doesn't even have a full-time executive secretary or director, maybe has a couple of days a week. There's lots of societies like that out there with 1 or maybe 2 journals. They don't have professional staff, let alone professional publishing staff. If you're in that scenario, then you can really see why it might be easier to go to one of the commercial publishers who will sort it all out for you. But what we want is an alternative solution where there's an easy-ish solution for a learned society of that sort to help them work out what to do without necessarily having to go to one of the really big publishers. What I'm not sure about is whether that solution is run through groups of learned societies getting together and working together. That's one option. Or is it through universities getting together and providing platforms for journals to run off? Or is it at national level? Or what is the right mix? Is it discipline-based? Is it nation-based? Is it institutional? I can imagine different versions of it, but I think it is collaborative, whatever it is. And I think at this point it might be worth putting in a plug for the Latin American countries, which do have a successful infrastructure for non-profit publishing that I think is government funded and run through their universities, but somebody else who knows more about Silio might be better placed to talk about that. But it's a very different model for open access publishing than we're used to in Europe or North America.
Yeah, I think your idea about university consortia or national systems, I think figuring out, this goes back to there is money in the system, right? Like the money's going somewhere now and the work is getting paid for. And the question is, what's that optimal mix? Because to be fair, 26% of income for a society is very meaningful, very, very meaningful, right? Changing something that would change that without a solution that was that filled that gap or that provided that service. Or again, back to the prestige, the chicken and egg question of prestige and money. Like if the prestige of the journal were established in a different way, other than it's subscribed to, it's the leading journal in the field. If a different measure were invented that communicated prestige in a different vocabulary, that might reinforce the need, the desirability of change. Alexia, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's no worries at all. This is really a great conversation, and Anita, Brett, and Aileen really raised some important points. And Aileen said several of the points that I was going to raise regarding the need for a more collaborative model between the learned societies. The other thing is that as we talk about prestige, we can't hoard that off or, kind of tint it away from the connection with prestige and tenure, right? Promotion and tenure within various colleges and universities, and who gets to assign prestige and why when it comes to certain journals. And so it's interesting to think about whether or not the funding model should precede the prestige discussion, whereas I am suggesting a complete disruption of it all, where we really start to examine how we assign junior faculty and faculty that seek to ascend to the rank of full, who ultimately will be the key influencers in a lot of our principal discussions and dialogues on how we move forward, open access, open scholarship, journal privilege, et cetera. How do we ensure that the higher education ecosystem is ready to not devalue open access and will not devalue open scholarship? And we're still tussling with that. We still have some energy and some reverberations within the academy that suggest that open scholarship and open access is, kind of trivial or not something that is necessarily as rigorous from a scholarly perspective as going through the so-called traditional scholarly pathways and models. So we also need to have that conversation as well. It's kind of who gets to assign prestige, But moreover, how do we disrupt the entire thinking regarding promotion and tenure so that promising faculty who are moving through the tenure stream can contribute very meaningfully to these discussions and also to the advanced movement of various journals?
I think that's really interesting. It goes back to what Anita was saying earlier about publicly engaged work. That if you're
Yep.
if there were value given, as I think there increasingly is in some, and certainly in some institutions, to recognizing that reaching and influencing and affecting a lot of people or people outside of the academy is also a value. That having a monolithic version or not version, but measure of prestige might get disrupted in the ways that you're discussing, right? That there's other kinds of value out there than the one version that is held court for a long time. Alex.
Yeah, is it okay if I moved a little bit more into the discussion of monographs?
Please.
Because some of the comments I have relate directly to this, thinking about collaborative work, thinking about valuing public-facing scholarship in the humanities, and also issues of accessibility and uptake. So I just wanted to share, and I want to thank my colleagues at Michigan who helped prepare some of this data for me, is that, I've been running the TOME program for the past 3 years. It started in 2017. And when it started, there was very little interest in it. There was a fixed deadline twice a year, and there were just like, you could count on, less fingers in one hand, you could count 2 or 3 submissions. When I stepped in, I decided that we should switch to a rolling deadline because, people are producing and having books accepted all throughout the year. And I think that was a good move that our committee agreed on. And we had a diverse committee with representation from the library, other humanities scholars, the research enterprise, and so on. So over the past 5 years, our TOME program, which has been cost shared with the college and the library, has funded 16 OA monographs. From presses that some of you might, think of right away. University of Minnesota has been at the forefront of this, but as well as others that you might not think of right away, like Routledge got on board. And I've seen over this time, first of all, more and more interest and enthusiasm of early career faculty, pre-tenure faculty in publishing OA. So for them, they really want to have their work to have that impact. And they are actively engaging in conversations from the get-go with editors in the press to do so. We've also seen that presses, some of which were reticent to sign the Creative Commons license at the beginning, now know they are eager to do so, or they've gotten on board with that. So that, to me, this is a short time period to see this kind of shift. I think it was accelerated by COVID as well, and the kind of increase of open access. So the question, of course, is how will this continue? So it's great that I think we're moving ahead with it. At the same time, as I have been reflecting on this, the questions that I've been engaging with are questions that we've already been kind of tussling with in this panel. And one of them is, do we just want to replicate the same model of publishing, but with OA with an on-demand print option? Do we want to disrupt it, as Alexia has suggested? And I think I'm all for the disruption, but I want to figure out more what the disruption is going to be and how that is going to, and we can think about this together, make this knowledge dissemination and research more equitable, aligned with DEI, DEIA work, and so on. And so that kind of prompts me to think, well, if we're talking about these ecosystems, and I've thought, like, what do these ecosystems look like? They're ecosystems that have very vibrant little pockets, but huge gaps in between. And that's where I think some of this collaborative work and some of this connectivity work that we need to do is really important. So I'll just stop there, but, I've learned a lot in these past 5 years. And I think the question now is, okay, there's journals, and there's monographs as we think of, humanities monographs. But there are many other ways of disseminating knowledge. There are many other ways of pulling digital humanities into this. and things can still have that prestige or, you know, some kind of review system attached to them. And so I think the next stages in thinking about OA for the humanities is like, well, how do we do that? Because we have to push the humanities out there and show its relevance for this whole enterprise to keep going. So that's my little soapbox on that, because I've been thinking about it. How we do that, I'm not quite sure, but I will, hopefully you all can tell me.
So before we turn to Anita, just one clarification, Alex, on Tome, which is a great project towards the open monograph ecosystem. My sense is, with your work at Michigan and the other universities that have been involved, that one of the points that we really have to trumpet about Tome, which is not, you know, it's not enormous in scale in terms of thousands and thousands of books or anything, but you've been able to justify the use of university funds to subvent the opening up of these monographs, right? That's what they're, when you say faculty member, are applying for, right?
Yes, indeed. And I mean, there is a consortium of universities that have been involved in this. We're certainly not the only one, and some are in the
Right.
Big Ten, and some are other public universities, some are private universities, et cetera. So we've been part of this movement. But yes, and that's where the resources, I mean, we are fortunate to have the resources that can support the faculty members who are interested in doing this. And not all institutions can do that. And then there's the question too of how sustainable is this over the long term, and what will this look like? Yeah, it was fun for the first 5 years. What about the next 5 years? What about 20 years hence? Where will we be? And I think we have to be very forward looking in terms of how we think about how this is sustainable and how this will be good for the research enterprise and humanities more generally.
Well, and that's all true. And those are the challenges. But I think anyone who's tried to find savings in one budget line and move it to another in a university knows that that's not how the real world works. So the fact that you've been able, in other words, it wasn't the library at the University of Michigan paying for the open access of the University of Michigan faculty. It was University of Michigan and the others, the universities in the Tome partnership, recognizing that this public good and this good for the university of having these monographs published was a responsibility of the university. Now, how to scale that and everything like that, it's still, back to our, there's money in the system. That's a really interesting example of money moving in the system, right? In ways that are difficult. Anita.
Something that Alex said that was triggering with me, because it crosses the discussion of both the monograph and the journal. She talked about how the consortiums itself had to finally get the presses, right, to be able to buy into it. And that in some way, the first question I had was, why would they? And this answer is prestige, because they're having more readerships for books that are actually in the system. And it made me start to think about the question of the journals and the learned societies, and talking about this idea of forming a consortium across the learned societies. Because if there was a collective of learned societies who were able to publish articles, it would increase the prestige for anyone who agreed to be a part of that ecosystem. And so I'm wondering if, as we continue this discussion about collaborations across the learned societies, if we can think about how the prestige model and even the funding model, even the merging of resources might be a more productive way to have people want to do more of this open access publishing.
So we are now going to turn to the questions. There are already a bunch of questions in our Q&A. We encourage others to ask them. And I'm going to do something really cruel to our panelists, which is I'm going to read the questions out. And then whichever one of you looks like desperate to answer that question, I'm going to call on you, but we can't all answer every question, right? Because there are too many good questions. So it's going to be a fight to the finish to see who gets to express enthusiasm the most. So the first question comes from Kathleen, sorry, get the full screen here. Kathleen James Chakraborty, who asks, I strongly support open access for readers, but at present, it is often extremely expensive for the authors, or if they can get them to pay for it and are not independent scholars, for their universities. How do we have open access that's equally available to all scholars as authors, while still providing a level of editorial support for nonprofit university presses and the nonprofit journals and scholarly societies that they've usually done. So the key question here is the author pay, the APC, the author pay charges, which are included in grants in the sciences, but not included in any grants that I've seen in the humanities or in traditional sort of institutional support. Who would like to address this? Aileen.
Well, the thing that strikes me is this is why we want to get away from a model of open access that assumes that APCs are the way to do it. Because here in the United Kingdom, we've had a policy world where APCs were being promoted for the last 10 years or so. It's unsustainable. And we've already seen the problems with that. And of course, it's inequitable because of what about the early career scholars? What about the independent scholars? What about the scholars at less wealthy institutions, let alone in other parts in the global south? There are other models of open access. I see that someone's mentioned subscribe to open further down the comments. There's one. You've also got various bronze or platinum or diamond, depending on your rhetoric, versions of open access. There are ways of creatively finding ways to support journals that don't have to involve authors paying, because yeah, it is, if you imagine, it's very difficult to imagine an equitable system for authors if authors have to pay and find the funds. So I think we should be exploring other options for our humanities journals. And there are other options out there. There are quite a few different models. The question at the moment is which one of those is actually going to work long term.
So the next question that I'm going to bring up, and some of you have been already talking about this internally in our chat, comes from Michael White. An assumption is being made that open access means more scholarship will be read. Is there any evidence for this? Research on digital publishing to date has concluded the opposite, that ease of searching leads to fewer articles being cited rather than more. What evidence do you have that this narrowing trend will be changed by OA? It's not been the logic of the digital age so far. And so this is a whole, the question also, I think, ties to the question of discovery, of whether the investments are being made to make open access literature discoverable, indexed, everything like that. So who would like to respond about this? Alexia.
Thank you. Yes, so I was sharing some things in the chat, and I guess this is very discipline specific, but we do have evidence from some publishers like Springer, as I said in the chat, and also the Association of College and Research Libraries intentionally tracks this type of data in addition to the Association of Research Libraries. And so we see some connection between open access and citations. And while there's a lot of banter, query, question around impact, we actually use citations as a measurable impact in relation to research impact. So yes, there are monographic downloads that can happen and have happened, and we do see an increase with that, and we use that metric as well. But to really be able to determine research's impact across various disciplines, the ways in which it continues to enrich the information ecosystem, we look at citations, and there's definitely evidence going back 20 plus years of there seeming to be a correlation between open access and an increase in open access citations.
Great. The next question is from Ross Mounts, who writes, subscribe to open is a very interesting potential model for existing learned society journals to transition to an equitable model of open access. Does the panel have any thoughts on subscribe to open for journals? And I'd also open that up even further, subscribe to open for books. And if anyone wants to answer this and also explain what subscribe to open means, or the various approaches to subscribe to open, that would be great.
Okay, so I'm not the world's greatest expert on this one. I think Ross knows more about it than I do, I think. But what it does is something a little bit like Knowledge Unlatched does for books, in that if you can get enough libraries to decide that they're going to purchase a book or subscribe to the journal this year, then you can get enough of them together, then they agree that rather than just buying it for themselves and having a copy in their own library, it can be open for everybody. Because after all, if the publishers made enough money to cover their costs that year, and they're willing not to keep trying to sell more copies, but just to accept that, okay, that's enough. We've covered our costs with that number of subscriptions or that number of book sales. Therefore, if we get that number, we can afford to make it open. So it's a version of that for journals where each year you find out if you can get enough subscribers to agree to subscribe to your journal at a certain price. And you try to encourage them to do this, usually by offering a slight discount if enough of them subscribe. And if they do, then you'll make it open access for everybody for next year. And there's more complications about the game theory of how you try to persuade libraries to sign up rather than try to be freeloaders on this. So I think that is quite an interesting example of how you could build a journal that would be open access without having to have author-facing fees on it, for instance. What I'm not sure about with it, and if Ross wants to type an answer to that in the chat, that would be lovely. But how does it work at the level of an individual learned society? How much admin does it take for that learned society to make that happen? Because that's what worries me about quite a number of these schemes, is that they're great in theory, but if you are this small learned society without dedicated and knowledgeable staff, can you actually do this? Or do you need a broker to do it on behalf of a whole group of learned societies, for instance?
Well, I think going back to our discussions earlier and the proposals that some shared collective action approaches, are part of the answer of how we do this, or how we do this to torque where the money that's in the system is utilized, and utilized both efficiently and effectively. I mean, I think the other thing that comes to mind about the subscribed open models, and there are various ones, is that, again, it's not an all or nothing, good versus evil approach. It's a very real world approach to saying we need answers. It's not compromising values to say we're going to recognize the needs of different players in the system, and yet still enfold ways of having the collective value of open as one goal, but not as sort of all or nothing, you must do this right away goal. So they're some very interesting models. I'm going to turn now to a question from GMT Emezui. Thank you for this insightful panel discussion. My question revolves around the issue of inequalities in the situation like we have in most Nigerian universities, where individuals fund their publications. Experiences show that many foreign journals charge high fees for, it's all bouncing around, sorry, for individual academics who wish to publish in open access journals. So what are the chances that the work of scholars from this part of the world can be on the open access platform? So it goes back to the fees question, the author pay charges. And any other thoughts on on-ramps for scholars writing from other parts of the world and trying to get into a system that is either dominated by the science model right now, or just closed to other scholars?
I just wanted to say that even though we're talking about it as if it's a gated community, let's say, the idea that they have to go through the online access, or they have to go on to the journals for their publications. I want to just throw out the new things, the academia and the research net, which are proliferating all over the web, where people are just uploading their articles so that people will read them, and then they can use those statistics in order to justify their value in the world. Like that's a off the grid market. It's a commercial market, and it's not a market that's tied to gatekeepers, and that people are using it because it's not tied to gatekeepers. So if I were from a smaller country and I just wanted my article read, I would put it up on one of those places where you can upload it yourself.
So this is sort of the collaborative model that we've been discussing, and the low overhead model, Anita. And Kathleen Fitzpatrick has written and said this is a large part of the goal of Humanities Commons, hcommons.org, opening up participation in the flows of scholarly communication to all. I guess one of the, I want to ask though, going back to the challenge of discovery, right? Like right now, and discovery, both in the sense of actual library discovery systems and indexing of open, again, if the goal of open access, one of them is to lower the costs and lower the dependence on the commercial providers who are very good at getting attention to things, right? So how does one get attention? And attention is not only discovery in searches, it's also discovery for in reviews and those other mechanisms that will lead to a book or a journal getting attention, right? So if the goal is to lower the cost so much that it's minimized investment in the dissemination method, who does the work of marketing, pre-sales marketing, post-sales marketing? We don't have to resolve it all today, but that's going to hang out there as a question.
Yeah, I can't answer the marketing question, but I can delve into a little bit around the discovery systems and discovery layers within academic libraries. There's a lot to be said for the ways in which faculty, colleagues, and researchers can really be principal authors and agents in that process. And so oftentimes, we will kind of send calls out to our relative faculty community and to our researchers. And truthfully, with everything, and this kind of speaks to what Anita was talking about in terms of just loads of layers of labor, right, on individuals. Discoverability takes a lot of time to get naming conventions in order, to make sure that nomenclature is in place and also metadata. And we in the academic library community, we would love to have more involvement from, the scholarly community writ large with whom you service. So there's opportunities, I believe, everyone, for us to think more intentionally and strategically around how scholars can help to advance layers of discovery within academic library systems.
Yeah, I think there are answers to how to do this, right? And there are, and yet it is harder to. I think it was a really good question about the utilization of open materials and everything like that. But I do think one can answer a situation that hasn't, where the inequalities or the inequities in exposure of some materials haven't been tried yet. You can't say, oh, people don't want to read that. People don't read those unless you follow the experiment through, right? I want to also point out, so let me read a good question from Stan Katz, and then point out one thing. So Stan writes, former president of ACLS, Stan writes, universities have little interest in funding humanities publishing. Look at the record over the past 20 years of university-based presses. Do you think universities or departments will be willing to prefer certain presses? I do not. It will take at least a generation to change the prestige structure, and we better come up with a more persuasive interim solution to this now very old problem. I think one of the things that Stan's pointing out is that that it's not that our university press infrastructure, that thousands, or at least many hundreds of colleges and universities are depending on to publish monographs and publish many of our journals too, are seen as the property of a particular university, the University of Chicago Press, the University of North Carolina Press, the University of Michigan Press, Yale University Presses. So they're funded either locally or by the market, which drives them towards the need to produce the revenue they need. I would point people to an article by Charles Watkinson and Melissa Pitts in Inside Higher Education about a year ago that was incredibly insightful, that we think of these as individual university presses, and they are, right? And they're associated with the individual universities, but they really are a shared infrastructure that all of these fields need. And so there is a gap between our thinking of these university presses as a unit of that university, again, which they are, and the fact that there are something like 110 university presses in all of North America. So that gap is really, if we leave that be, right, and we think that it's everybody's, each institution's or each press's problem to solve, we're gonna get what we pay for, or what we ask people to pay for. I'm going to the next question, which is, the question is, could ACLS, from Sophie Marinez, could ACLS offer grants to former fellows to publish their books as open access, as NEH does for former fellows and awardees? So this is a really interesting question of Brett's nodding, right? Brett's ready, signing ACLS. We're happy to discuss ideas like this, and we do. I think what's really interesting is the question that, you know, what do we need as peer review, right? Like one of the questions of prestige and of knowing what one gets in a particular journal or a particular university press monograph is that it has been peer reviewed, right? And we all know that that there are stages of peer review, and there's better peer review and there's weaker peer review. But I think it really is interesting, and Brett, feel free to comment on this, that a fellowship process has already been a pretty rigorous peer review process. Now, presses will still need to do their own peer review, and that's great. But the idea of competitions around existing fellowship programs or existing fellowship winners, there are a lot of questions of stage of career and what one would focus on. But these are really interesting questions, and we at ACLS would love to hear from you in the audience about this going forward. Brett, do you have any thoughts?
I'll just throw in exactly what you said. At the NEH, in order to get one of our fellowships, you go through an enormous peer review process. And then in order to get your book published, it gets peer reviewed again. So if that publisher comes to the NEH and says, hey, we'd like a few extra $1,000 to make this open access, we pretty much do it automatically because we feel like it's already been thoroughly peer reviewed. It does not need to go through a third peer review. We just kind of make that grant. And we've been very pleased with that program because it's really taken a lot of terrific books and made them available to a very wide audience. So we've really received very positive feedback from the field on that. And if ACLS would like to follow suit with your fellowship programs, give me a call. I'll be happy to tell you how we do it.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take a part of a question from Rebecca Gordon, which says, ideally membership in a scholarly society would include research library access beyond the kind often offered to alumni. So anyone have thoughts on the role of that scholarly societies can play as sort of an intermediary in helping with some of these access questions? So in other words, if you're an unaffiliated scholar, or if you finish your PhD, you don't have a steady teaching post, or you're teaching at 3 or 4 different places, and your library privileges end at the end of the semester, you know, are there ways, and this, happy to broaden this to both to primary journal literature, monograph literature. I mean, it does seem like a huge inequity that people working to stay in the field are somewhat systematically shut out of opportunities to do the work that will keep them in the field.
I think it's interesting as you move through this, we're going to have to be a member of the Scholarly Society, then we're going to have to win a grant, then we're going to have to be able to have it double vetted before we can get the idea out there. Just wanted to put out that that's kind of where we're going down this spiral. It's like we want to have the rigorous scholarship, and we also want to be academic, right? But that the barriers are coming higher and higher the more we talk about ways in which people can access the platform to be able to be open access.
I'm in the midst of my technological confusion as I try to switch back from questions to the screen. See which is answered and what it hasn't been answered. Wait, Brett, do you want to share something? Or great. All right. I think we're getting ready to wrap up. If there are questions that panelists have for each other, or closing thoughts about some of these questions about experiments that might be tried, or barriers that have to be gotten open. One of the thoughts I was thinking is that I've used the word infrastructure in various ways. I spoke about Charles Watkinson and Melissa Pitts's article about the collective infrastructure that university presses represent. I think that one of the things that some of our work with a commission on supporting diverse digital scholarship has brought up is the other infrastructures of, as we talked about, and Alexia talked about, discovery, about reviews, and other ways of exposing, getting better exposure for open access material. I think what both Alex and Anita brought up about new forms of scholarship, digital, multimedia, and the need to recognize, that these forms need to be recognized, and they also might not fit neatly into the box of the existing infrastructure. Other thoughts on things that we're losing out of by being constrained by well-established models that we know how they work and we can't seem to shake loose of.
I'll just reiterate something that I think Anita talked about it earlier. The idea of publishing in non-traditional places, right? You don't have to only publish in journals or in monographs. I think James, you mentioned Humanities Commons, I think, which is a wonderful which is a wonderful website where anyone can publish humanities articles and get it wide exposure all around the world, open access. I think there's a lot of things we should be exploring in terms of alternate ways of publishing information that don't necessarily go through those older models.
Great. Alex.
I'll also add that I think, the onus is on us in administrative roles in humanities to really be creating space for the valuing of various forms of scholarly output, and really to be understanding more broadly what is humanities scholarship, particularly public-facing scholarship. So I have been heartened to see that more of the pre-tenure faculty in Michigan are interested in publishing OA. Now that is because often the prestige factor comes with the press they're publishing with, and there's an on-demand print version available if needed, and so on. But really, we do have antiquated models of measuring scholarly output. They are typically articles. They are typically a monograph, which has morphed from a dissertation and is much enhanced, is typically the case. But there are many other ways of, there are collaborative projects. There are people involved in digital projects. I have colleagues who have developed wayfinding, historically informed apps that people use. I mean, there's many different ways of doing kind of scholarship and disseminating it and valuing it. And so I think that is an ongoing issue for, people in my position and others who really want to widen our understanding of what should count. What should count? And if it is going to count, what is the criteria for assessing it? That is not the old criteria. It's got to be new and evolved criteria. And I think that that has to be part of this bandwagon effort of open access, and certainly take down as many gates as possible. I know that comes with financial requirements, but nonetheless, I think we can't forget, particularly when we're talking about the tenured track and tenured side of things, this really comes with reassessing what are the criteria on which we're judging people for their scholarship and their value in the humanities.
It's an incredibly important point that, again, the institutional change means working at all levels. And as you say, the sort of instinctive limiting of what counts and particularly what formats count, but also what particular publications count. I just want to point out a really important work done by American Historical Association and Modern Language Association, working together with their communities about giving guidelines for how to give credit for digital scholarship or publicly engaged scholarship. This norm-setting function of the horizontal communities that can evolve over time. What constitutes good work is incredibly important to the decision making on individual campuses. A lot more needs to be done in getting this work out there and getting those changes, which happen slowly to happen. But Alex's point is super important. Alexia.
Mhm. So James, you asked, I think, what are we losing? And so I would definitely say time. As someone noted in the Q&A section, we've spent 2 decades kind of having what almost feels like a very circular conversation, with not a lot of like infrastructure, social infrastructure or grounding happening. I feel particularly anxious that we are losing time. And I say that because when we think of our colleagues internationally and we think of the global majority, often which we refer to as those individuals who live within the so-called global South, the on-ramp to the internet for many of those individuals are through mobile devices. We're not even ready to have conversations around discoverability and open access platforms in a mobile environment because we're still kind of tinkering around these concepts of prestige and a monograph and a journal article and what's a journal article and what's scholarship, when in fact the world very quickly is shifting to a new majority that will be thinking about and contextualizing scholarly contribution in real-time ways through platforms that we haven't even thought of, right? And so I feel like that's another piece. Someone else had also raised in the chat that there are member consortium organizations like Lyricist, of which I'm on the board of, that tries to bring together cultural heritage organizations. And that's the part of the conversation we haven't had yet as well. And so while we talk about learned societies, research libraries, academic libraries, archives, we haven't also brought our colleagues in from museums and other cultural heritage organizations that help to enrich the humanities on the ways in which these topics of discoverability, object-based pedagogy, and other things should be central in our conversations around open access.
Well, a huge set of questions there, Alexia, and Anita might have thoughts on that. I mean, I think the inclusion of primary source material and publications, particularly with works under copyright, can be very difficult for opening up access, right? I mean, sometimes people we referred earlier to the Creative Commons license. Sometimes works can be signed in the public domain, but sometimes artist estates can want to reserve and the right to manage the dissemination of representations of works, which don't fit with the digital distribution model very well, right? So there are challenges that remain. Anita, do you have thoughts on the questions of
I just think that the schism between what we imagine is the academic world and what we are imagining is an audience of people who are readers and learners is really, it's not what we think it is. It's like, I think that this collective of people who are in here in this room are people who are basically centered in kind of the older institution of academia. And so I was very grateful to Alexia for pointing out that there is another world of learners out there. And many people are learning online in ways that have very little to do with what learned societies are doing. And I love scholarship, deeply engaged investigative scholarship, but I think we have to work harder and harder to try to bridge that gap, because the people who are the new academicians are coming from that world, and we can't pretend they're not.
And the students of tomorrow and the people that are going to help the humanities and interpretive social sciences thrive, right? I mean, if we're talking only to ourselves and that's the measure of success, that's going to limit the health of the ecosystem more generally. I can't thank you all enough. You all are super smart and really interesting. And I think that these questions, no one pretended that the questions are easily resolved or that the questions of who pays for what and how we got here and where we're going to go are simple ones. So I thank you all. I thank the audience for joining us today. We will continue to talk about all of these topics. So if you have interest, please stay tuned. We'd love to hear more feedback about this. ACLS continues to think about the well-being of these sectors, and think about it makes it sound like we're sitting on some mountain thinking about it. We think about it in context of the societies with whom we work with closely, their fellowship programs, that we carry out, the funders with whom we work, the scholars at universities in our university consortium and in our associates network. And the one mistake that I promise you we will not make is thinking that we have the answers from sitting alone in our Zoom rooms or on in our offices on 3rd Avenue. We only are going to be able to make good contributions if we get the thoughts of people in our audience and to this wonderful panel of people that we had today.